I'm Paulina Leiser, producer of Focus Today. Thank you for watching this video, and make sure to check our other videos at theDove.us.
Welcome back, and we are delighted to have with us today Mike Riggs. He's the Communications Director for Families Against Mandatory Minimums, better known as FAMM with 2 M's, a journalist, and he's covered all kinds of civil liberties and criminal justice policies for various publications. And we want to talk to him today about mandatory minimums. So Mike, good to see you. How are you, my friend?
I'm good, Perry. How are you?
Fine. Good to see you. Where are we Skyping you in from? Where are you?
I'm in Washington, D.C. right now. I'm originally from Central Florida, though.
Okay, good to see you. Well, what is mandatory minimums, or what are mandatory minimums?
Well, mandatory minimums are a type of criminal sentence in which there's no negotiation over how long the person will serve. The idea is kind of that everybody, regardless of where they get convicted of their sentence, gets the same long sentence. Regardless of whether it's in New York or Texas or Florida or South Carolina. And while the intention behind these were really good, we've made them way too long, and we don't take individual circumstances into account when we hand them down, which is why our group exists.
Okay, so by the way, you can go to FAMM, FAMM.org, and find out more about it, FAMM.org. So where does case law play into this? Because I know that was part of the argument, and then you have Senator Cruz and Bill O'Reilly pushing for it. How does that play into the mix?
So Kate's law is a response to the killing of Kate Steinle in San Francisco, which is an absolute tragedy by an illegal immigrant who had been deported and re-entered the country multiple times. And as is unfortunately so often the case, this really shocking, horrible thing that has happened, the folks in Washington have had this response of, let's use a hammer for something that might more likely require a scalpel. So Kate's law, it has a lot of different things in it that probably are perfectly good policy, but one of the things that's not is this idea that anybody who's been deported, if they come back into the country after being deported, they automatically have to serve a 5-year prison sentence. That's a long time, and that's a lot of people.
So what are you recommending?
Well, I'm not sure what the best answer is for the question of illegal reentry. But what we do know is that the federal government prosecutes about 20,000 illegal reentry cases every single year. The average sentence for those people who come back in is 18 months. Now, that doesn't sound very long to some people, but what it allows federal prosecutors and federal courts to do is basically do what's called a rocket docket, or a fast-track prosecution. The idea is you've got a courtroom full of people who have re-entered the country illegally. They're told, you take 18 months, then we deport you. So everybody ends up pleading guilty, because that doesn't sound like a long time to some of these folks. You change that 18 months to 5 years, though, and you might see people say, you know what, I don't want to plead guilty. I want to take my case to trial. And our federal court system just can't handle that kind of load.
All right. So in the meantime, you have these dangerous people slipping through the cracks. What do we do, Mike? I mean, we're all frustrated. I think the citizenry is just frustrated that the system is broken and cannot work fast enough to solve the problem.
I think that's absolutely right. I'm not sure what the good answers are. I mean, we've heard a lot of interesting proposals. We've heard, strengthen the border, build a wall, do more to discourage employers from hiring people who aren't documented. There's definitely a lot of stuff that we haven't tried that we probably should. And if you were to think about our responses to illegal reentry on a spectrum, from things that are sort of mild and maybe aren't going to be very effective, all the way up to things that are possibly a little too draconian, the portion of Kate's law that says 5-year mandatory minimum for everybody who comes back, regardless of whether or not they're this man in San Francisco who killed Kate Steinle, or whether it's a mother who was separated from a child and she was deported and they stayed and she just wanted to be near her kids. We need something that's a little bit more nuanced, if that makes sense, at least when it comes to the penalties.
Well, there was a a theme here years ago in Oregon. You do the crime, you do the time, and we were trying to, stand on these mandatory sentences. But part of the problem is, whether it's county level, state level, or federal level, is overcrowding. And so, in addition to clogging up the courts, we now have an overcrowding issue. So you kind of wonder, will we ever get our handle on crime?
Yeah, so what's interesting is there's actually been a lot of research done on the most effective ways to punish people in such a way that they're not going to reoffend. I mean, this is the ultimate goal of the criminal justice system. You can't not punish people who break the law. You have to punish people who break the law. The question is, how do we punish them in such a way that when we release them back into society, we don't see them in our courts again. We don't see them in our police stations again. We don't see them in our prisons again. And one of the things that we know works kind of well is something called swift and certain sanctions. The idea being that if somebody who's on probation, for instance, or parole, and this is about half of our prison population across the country, are people who have violated probation or parole. So we're not doing a very good job, as a rule, of taking criminals and turning them back into law-abiding citizens. But one of the things that we know works is these swift and certain sanctions. So if you violate probation or parole, instead of getting a warning or being told next time you're really in trouble, you violate probation or parole, 24 to 48 hours in jail immediately. And there's a program out in Hawaii that does this. South Dakota's experimented with it, and it's got really great returns. But, the question of whether or not we're ever going to get crime under control is really a question of how do we get people who get into the system once and make sure that it's only once and they don't come back.
So I'm hearing you say that what FAMM may try to do is back to the rocket track or the fast track for a repeat offender. I mean, why go through the whole case again? Why don't we just, if they have broken probation or they have re-entered and committed a crime, boom, they go to the big house and they're there for a long time?
I mean, it just comes down to what works, right? I mean, if that was the thing that worked, if 5 years would work, I'm not sure that there'd be a ton of opposition to it. But the research shows that mandatory minimums don't deter crime. And to give a good example of this, when I go to talk to college students about how the federal criminal justice system works, these are smart kids, good grades, law-abiding citizens, except for maybe a little underage drinking. They're good kids. And I ask them, what's going to send them to prison? And I rattle off a dozen different things that when you first think about it, you're like, well, maybe. Well, I don't know. And then I ask them, well, how long do you think you'd go away for that kind of thing? They have no idea. Most Americans, even college-educated Americans, have no idea what the penalties are for various offenses. Part of this is because the Federal Criminal Code, which had 23 offenses when the first Congress wrote the first federal laws in our new country, now has 5,000 federal criminal penalties. And the states have their own. So part of the problem is that people just don't know what's legal and what's not. The other part of the problem is that people who know that what they're doing is illegal have no idea what the penalties are for various offenses. So it's an education issue. So we can pass as many harsh laws as we want, but it's not going to stop people from committing these crimes because they don't know. They don't understand it. You need lawyers for these things, and most criminals don't walk around with a lawyer while they're committing their crimes. And then the other thing we need, ultimately, besides people knowing what the penalties are, is we need a way to turn their lives around. A lot of people can be helped. None of this really speaks to the illegal reentry question, right? Because we don't have a lot of good answers for that. We have a ton of proposals on the table. I'm not sure any of them have really been tested in terms of evidence. But I can tell you that mandatory minimums don't work for drug offenses. They don't work for driving under the influence. We just have a ton of crimes that we know mandatory minimums don't work for. And I am hard-pressed to believe that they're magically going to work for people, many of whom don't even speak English as a first language.
Wow. So I'm hearing you also say that even the incarcerated, the program inside the prisons and the jails do nothing to reform. Now, we know there are some successes out there. Prison Fellowship, Chuck Colson and others have had some great success. Why aren't we taking that and making it the model? Why are we just housing these people like animals and then turning them out again?
That is an excellent question. It's one of the things that when we talk to legislators here in Washington, D.C., we bring up all the time. Prison Fellowship is doing an amazing job. Craig DeRoche, Pat Nolan, Chuck Colson, who's most of his life was spent trying to help these people become better versions of themselves and walk closer with God. We don't know why bureaucrats don't care more about what works and what doesn't for helping people get back on their feet. I do know that for all the amazing work Prison Fellowship has done, they can't do it alone. They can't do it if legislators don't care. They can't do it if bureaucrats see what they do as just clocking in 9 to 5 and then leaving. And we can't do it if the country as a whole sees people in prison as irredeemable, is not able to be saved, is not, susceptible to God's grace. And, it's good that we're having this national conversation right now. People are still fearful, and I understand that. I get that all the time. I mean, if you spend enough time working with prisoners or talking to prisoners, especially prisoners whose their circumstances are informed by poverty or substance abuse, you definitely get to see that these are real human beings and that they can turn their lives around. But if you live your life on the straight and narrow, and your family does too, and you come from a good home or a good neighborhood, a lot of times these folks are really terrifying to you just in the abstract. But we definitely need more. We need Prison Fellowship to be bigger. We need their reach to be bigger, and we need more groups like them working in prisons and jails.
What about the example of Angola? I mean, incredible example of what a prison can do.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I mean, there are a few things in Angola that aren't great, solitary confinement and that kind of thing. But that is a place that is working. And what's interesting about Angola is one of the reasons it's a place where they think about what can we do with prisoners to sort of improve their lives and make them feel like, prepare them to enter society, is that it's kind of at the warden's discretion. I mean, the warden of Angola cares about these things, and so he tells his staff, this is what we're going to do, and this is what we're going to care about. And if you think of prisons are essentially a bunch of small fiefdoms, they're their own little kingdoms, and wardens have almost absolute power. So, that's another thing that if you look at our government writ large, there is such a thing as a good bureaucrat. There's a lot of ones that are not great, though. So, and that's true in prisons just like it is at the IRS and the EPA.
Well, Mike, this is great stuff. Let me encourage you. Mike, again, is the communications director for Families Against Mandatory Minimums. And what you may want to do, that's FAMM, FAMM.org, FAMM.org. This certainly plays well into the whole ministry aspect of inside prisons and beyond. It's one thing to take care of them on the inside. It's another thing to follow through on the outside, and that's a whole other issue. But, Mike, thanks for your work. Let's stay in touch, okay?
Yeah, thank you, Perry.
Good to see you. We'll be right back.